Croeso bawb i'r Senedd. Elin Jones dwi, a fi yw llywydd y Senedd yma. I'm Elin Jones, and I'm the presiding officer of the Senedd. Welcome to you all. Welcome in particular to Julia Gillard. We're very happy here in the Senedd to be offering a home for this event tonight. It was a sellout in its original home. It's a sellout even here tonight. I think Laura was thinking of moving to the stadium earlier today on Twitter, I saw. But I think the intimacy, hopefully, of the Senedd as a location will put us all at home. And it's most appropriate, I think, that you are here in the Senedd. And if your family had decided to stay in Wales, you could well have been one of our early First Ministers here in the Senedd. We've never had a female First Minister in our 20 years, and and it's a yet. Yes, you're right, Helen. But we have an excellent record on gender equality. The first cabinet in the world to have a majority of women in 2003, the first parliament in the world to elect 50% female and 50% male. However, our track record on respect and equality for women in politics is not perfect, and we hope that the insight, Julia, that you give us tonight from your experience will help us to improve here in this Senedd as well. Felly, croeso nôl I Gymru, welcome back to Wales, and I'm handing over now to Laura McAllister and to the Wales Governance Centre. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you very much. Well, diolch yn fawr iawn, Llywydd. Thank you very much indeed, Elin, for that introduction and for helping us to meet what has proved incredible demand to come along and listen to this in conversation with Julia Gillard. As I said this morning, I think we could have probably sold out the Cardiff City Stadium had we planned a little bit further ahead. But I think it's testimony to the interest that there is in Julia's career, particularly in terms of what she's been able to do with regard to gender and politics. But also, I think we should never forget that, you know, Julia's done quite a lot of firsts, really. I mean, she was the first female Prime Minister of Australia, first female leader of the Labour Party. When I was researching some of the background to this, I saw some weird kind of firsts that they labelled at you as well. The first person who wasn't born in Australia to become Prime Minister, is that right?
No, that's actually not right.
No, well, that sounds strange, doesn't it?
Yes.
And the first person, I think this sums up some of the treatment that you did have, the first person who wasn't married to become Prime Minister of Australia. Again, what a weird thing to level at somebody, whether that's true or not true. But, you know, you've held serious ministerial positions. You've been the first Prime Minister of your country. So we're incredibly interested to hear more about your political journey, but obviously have some discussions as well about your position on women and power in this climate. And let's start with that, because I think we're living in a time where we're seeing some quite incredible sexism, misogyny, harassment, abuse. You can call it what you like, but none of it is pleasant, whether that's in this country or across the world. I mean, is it worse now, or is it just us thinking it should be better?
I think it's a bit of both. I think it's us thinking it should be better, and it should be better by now, because how long have we been at this journey of women's equality? You know, we're in this constant state of trying for equality. I think we've all got the itchy sense that we'd like to be there instead of still sort of trying. Second, I think the new media, social media, has enabled a lot of it to come out of the shadows. So I debate this with myself a lot, and I'm really not quite sure. Did people always think those sexist and misogynistic things but not have an outlet for them because they wouldn't walk up to someone's face and say them? Or is it objectively worse now? I don't know, but certainly the environment feels very heavy for women in the public square, because whenever they look down at their social media feeds, it's quite likely to be full of death threats and rape threats and all sorts of other, you know, vile things, so it makes it very tough.
And what's the responsibility of political leaders now, male and female, to address these issues? I mean, we're currently in the middle of some quite serious criticism of the Prime Minister of the UK in this respect, but he's not the only one. Across the water, we've seen President Trump engage in a similar vocabulary in terms of his speeches. So what's the responsibility? Are they reflecting a public mood, or is there something else?
I think public discourse has been coarsened. I think we're in this cycle. Once again, the change in media rhythms has impacted politics. So, you know, we all know that mostly day-to-day people don't watch politics. They've retreated very much into their own kind of community bubble, their own personal bubble. Social media, I think we originally thought would link people to the sort of global and universal, but in its initial manifestation it actually linked people more intensively to other individuals in their sphere and other individuals of like views. And I think politicians have got used to having to be even more outrageous and flamboyant and shrill to get their message through. You know, in the old days, they'd sort of know that they were going to get a run on the 6 o'clock news and that overwhelmingly people would be watching the 6 o'clock news. Now they feel they've got to project even more to get through to people. And so we've got this, you know, circle of politicians being more outrageous, social media fracturing the debate, social media giving people anonymity, and it's all come together to create quite an unpleasant atmosphere. I'm very careful about how much I lecture about civility in politics because, as I said earlier at the press conference with the First Minister, anybody would be able to go back to my speeches in question time and clip a bit here and clip a bit there and say, who's she to be lecturing on civility in politics? I used to give as good as I got. But I do think that there is a particular responsibility on leaders when nations are in the middle of polarising and fractious debates. It's one thing to, you know, have a witticism, even particularly, even maybe a harsh word over the dispatch box in question time. It's another thing to be making statements that, because the country is already very worked up, are going to be heard and translated beyond that question time arena and perhaps have meaning and motivation for people that you didn't actually intend when you said them. So I think in times like this, the Brexit debate here particularly, it does call for a little bit of coolness in the way in which messages are communicated.
But where do we draw the line, Julia? As you said, you know, you grew up in a quite robust political culture, let's say, and lots of us who have been involved in politics from outside have seen similar things in Scotland and Wales. But, you know, where do we draw the line? You know, because looking back at your period as Prime Minister, you endured some things that, for anybody, I think, would have crossed the line of what was decent and civil and responsible.
Yeah, there's never an excuse for sexism or racism or homophobia or any of those discriminatory kinds of conduct in public life. So it's, you know, not a witticism in question time to resort to any of those sort of old tropes about a woman, about a person from a different race, and so it goes. So I personally don't object to the adversarial culture in our parliaments. I always used to think to myself when I was there that if you passionately believe in something, then you should have a red hot go. But having a red hot go at the argument, even from time to time, you know, projecting some sort of force against your opponent, that doesn't have to tip over into sexist and racist abuse, and it doesn't have to tip over into language that might be interpreted, particularly by a divided community outside, as an invitation or a normalisation of violence.
This is probably a bit more controversial, but is there a difference between race and sex/gender here? Because it seems to me that things that are being said about women in public office would never be said in most circles about somebody because of the colour of their skin or their racial background. I mean, I mean, it might be different in Australia, but it's hard to say that the same things are being levelled in both cases here.
I think that's right. I mean, one of the things that I used to talk about in Australia, in my time post-politics, not particularly during it, is you would recall that there was a time when people were rallying, holding up signs that said "ditch the witch," and famously the then leader of the opposition, Tony Abbott, went and stood in front of one of those signs to address the assembled protest. And, you know, I have said to people since, if we had our first Indigenous Australian as Prime Minister, and someone went and stood in front of a sign that said, and excuse the language, but I'm just trying to illustrate the point, that said, you know, "sack the black bastard," I think that would be a career-ending moment. You would not come back from that in Australian politics. That would just be viewed as so offensive. So I agree with you. I think the boundaries in some ways in public discourse around race are clearer than they are around gender, which is not an argument for releasing these boundaries. It's definitely an argument for getting better and better about the gendered imagery and eradicating it from discourse. Yeah.
And how do you police it? I mean, we've had issues here in the National Assembly about language and portrayal of women, and indeed responses from women to sexism. How can it better be policed? You know, I mean, commissioners and protocols can only do so much, really, and even then, you know, one person's life experience is not necessarily going to equip him or her to deal with some of these really complex issues.
Yeah, I don't know about here in the Welsh Assembly. Obviously, in our Parliament, the Speaker has quite strong powers to get people to retract things, to apologise for them. People can be expelled, sort of sin-binned for a short period of time. They can be named and chucked out of the Parliament for a longer period of time. So that's the sort of rules working to create norms. Beyond that, though, I do think how the community, how the media reacts, shapes what politicians feel they should and shouldn't do. I mean, ultimately, if they feel that this imagery, gendered imagery, is helping them win the argument because the public is accepting it, even leaning into it, then they will keep doing it. If they think it's jeopardising their ability to get the argument across, then they'll stop doing it. Now, hopefully, most politicians would make a decision just based on the fact that it's wrong, but if they haven't made that decision, then pushback from voters, from the community does matter.
But isn't it alarming that we see, I mean, if you look at the opinion polls, we see a decline in popularity for our current Prime Minister, for Trump, amongst women in the context of recent remarks. But there's still a lot of people who will accept the legitimacy of some of those comments towards women and would still support that political leader. And I mean, what does that tell us about the climate that we live in?
Well, I think this climate is a very fractured one, and in some ways, we aren't going to win the arguments around gender if we only focus on gender. I think that there's a broader landscape here, and there's no doubt that there are communities, individuals who feel like the pace of change, the global financial crisis, all of it has left them behind. And they are angry about that, frustrated about that. This has been well analysed in the context of US politics, middle to upper age range, predominantly white men who feel that the world has somehow passed them by, that they used to know their place in it and they no longer do. And, I think we've got to strive to understand that. I turned 58 recently. You could be a man of my vintage. I was born in 1961, and feel like every certainty you thought you'd be born into had changed. You thought you would marry and be the head of your household, and now gender equality has made that difference. You thought you might have a manufacturing job for life in the local car plant. The local car plant is closed. There's all of this stuff about globalisation that is pressing on your world, and it makes you anxious about your son's future, your daughter's future, your grandson's future, your granddaughter's future. You know, anger is an understandable response to that. And unless we are addressing those underlying causes of what is discomforting people, we're not going to see change behaviours. It's never going to be enough to just sort of, oh, don't say things like that, don't applaud when people say things like that. We've got to get to grips with what's the real problem.
So let's just talk for a moment about your leadership. I mean, you were Prime Minister for 3 years and 3 days, I think. Leadership in any sector can be a very lonely place, but I think probably when you recount that period, it sounded like, you know, an incredibly tough environment to be operating in. When you look back now, you know, what's your take on it? Were there things you would have done differently, or was that just living in a very difficult, fractious moment and responding to it?
Oh, I mean, you know, you don't spend a period in leadership without learning some things. You don't spend a period in leadership without thinking, you know, if I had my time again, I would have done this a bit differently or that a bit differently. And I do think that about my period in office. I particularly regret some of the lack of political campaigning, communications, sophistication. We should have brought that to the carbon pricing campaign, and we didn't. We got out-campaigned. And so I absolutely regret that I wasn't better at that we weren't better at that. But in the fundamentals, you know, there's not a big policy reform I would go back and not do. There's not a big decision that I wouldn't take. So I'm satisfied with the fundamentals. There are some of the more day-to-day tactics that ended up having profound implications for how the community viewed, particularly our climate change policies, that I do regret.
I mean, people forget that you were operating, you know, a minority government, and you know it was unusual, wasn't it, for the federal, for there to be a minority or hung parliament at federal level in Australia. I think there had been, was it 80 years or 70 years previously, the last one. Things have changed, obviously, to a degree now. But you know, what can you imagine? I mean, this is a hard question, I know, but what would have been different had you had a majority and been able to spend less time on the negotiations and keeping together government and pursuing a different agenda? Would it have been different?
Yeah, in some ways, you know, I mean, everybody would like to walk into Parliament with a thumping majority and just be able to snap their fingers and get things through, of course. And I would have got a lot more sleep, because when parliaments have thumping majorities, they let the Prime Minister go home early. When parliaments don't, you know, are always a vote or two here or there, then you end up staying all of the hours that Parliament's sitting. So, you know, yes, of course I would have loved a thumping majority. But for our big reforms, what it really meant was that we pulled forward into the House of Representatives the kind of negotiations we would have had to have had in the Senate anyway. Whilst minority government in the House of Representatives is relatively unusual in Australia, what is a political norm is for governments not to have a majority in the Senate. It's only very briefly in contemporary history that governments had a majority in the Senate. That was the Howard government in its last parliamentary term, the Conservative government, before it was defeated in 2007. And I try to explain to people that our Senate is kind of like your House of Lords, except it's elected. And it's, you know, it was originally conceptualised as the state's house, so each state sends an equal number of senators, so which does mean you don't get the same kind of result you would on the two-party vote around the nation. So it's, you know, governments have had to negotiate in the Senate with the Greens political party, with various independents, with what was for a while a small centrist political party called the Australian Democrats, to get their legislation through. We pulled all those negotiations forward, and if we could get something through the House, we knew we could get it through the Senate. So in that sense, you know, the burden of negotiation would have been there. And the strength that comes with negotiation. We sort of put this frame around a political leader needing to discuss things with others from other political parties as if it's a weakness. In fact, it can end up enriching the legislative agenda and becoming a strength, and ultimately I felt like that about it. I thought our legislation was better and stronger because we needed to consult a variety of others.
How do you contend with this idea that is often put forward, completely erroneously, but the idea that if a woman is in power for a short period of time and it ends in whatever you call failure or rejection, that it sets back the cause of women in politics? I mean, it's a ludicrous concept, of course, as if a premier can represent the whole of a sex. But, I mean, how do we answer that criticism? It's been thrown at Theresa May recently, hasn't it, in light of her premiership? Yeah,
it has, and it's a crazy criticism. When I was, when I finished being Prime Minister, I was voted out by my political party. So you're going through the not very pleasant process of packing up your office. I took a call from a great Labor legend and former Prime Minister Paul Keating, who is known for his turns of phrase. And so I pick up the phone in what I think is going to be a kind of condolence call, and Paul says to me, "We all get taken out in a box, love." By which he meant, there's not too many elegant exits from politics. Some people serve and say they've had enough and retire. But actually the norm is either your political party kicks you out or the voters kick you out. And that happens, it's been happening to men in Australia since we've had the federal parliament. It's been happening here in the UK since, hundreds of years. That is the way it is. Why should we put a frame of failure around that for a woman? Because her political career is going exactly the same way in terms of likely end as a man's political career.
I want to talk about this concept of resilience, because in your autobiography you talk a lot about that, and I think all of us who've taken on any leadership roles know that you need to have resilience, but equally it has to be exercised with restraint, or one can appear to be less connected with the people that we're serving. And I think you talked at one point about it being like a muscle that needed to be exercised, which I liked. Tell us, how did you develop your resilience, and how did you keep it in check, so to speak?
Yeah, I think just personality-wise, I'm a pretty even-tempered, calm person. I'm not someone with, big oscillations of mood. So there's that as a foundation stone. And then when I was a young politician, I watched some of the older politicians, and often chronological age and political generation aren't correlated, so they weren't necessarily that much older than me, but they were more senior than me in the political party at that point. And I very clearly remember seeing some of those more senior politicians who, on a day of good headlines, you could see that they felt good about themselves, kind of sparkling eyes, shoulders thrown back, they were on top of the world. And on a day of bad headlines, they felt badly about themselves, so grey-faced, turned inwards, not communicating with colleagues. And I always watched that and thought how crazy it was that you would sort of ransom your sense of self-esteem and your mood to the capricious ways of headline writers. Like, seemed to me odd, because on both days you were exactly the same person. And so I watched that and I thought about it, and as I became more senior, I constantly gave myself that advice. This hasn't changed who I am because the headline's good today, and it won't change who I am because it's going to be bad tomorrow. And I was able to therefore get quite a dispassionate sense about the media reporting, not really let it hit me. But on the kind of connection with the public, I think, and I've looked at this through the sort of research lens more and more since I've left politics, there's a very narrow pathway for women leaders to walk. And so if you're too controlled, then you're, robotic, emotionless, not empathetic and nurturing, which is what people expect of women. If you're too emotional, well, clearly you haven't got the, the grunt for the job. If you're too animated, outgoing, happy, then you're sort of, flighty. If you're too animated in a forceful sense, then you're shrill, even hysterical. So it is a fairly narrow path, and I think lots of women leaders end up, because our stereotype of leadership is ultimately a male stereotype, we still have all sorts of unconscious biases in our heads when we try and put it down on a female leader, and it gets to be quite a narrow path for her to walk.
And how do you deal with this pressure to conform, which falls out of what you're saying there, really, that not just in politics, but any woman who's taken on a leadership role will tell you that there's pressure to behave in a certain way and to dress in a certain way and speak in a certain way, even if it means sacrificing aspects of one's own personality to do it. So how do you carve that way through it without losing yourself? Because clearly that's a great relationship you have with the people you serve.
Yeah, in some ways I didn't feel a whole loss of self, but I was aware that there were these pressures and differences about how a woman would be seen. I mean, on appearance, I was a lawyer before I was in politics. I wore suits. I was comfortable wearing suits. That wasn't me conforming to a male dress standard. Just a comfortable kind of uniform approach to what you should wear to the office, so you didn't have to puzzle through it every day. All of this, came to have so much more pressure around it when I was Prime Minister, because you didn't get the benefit of a received uniform. So if you went with lawyer-like business suits every day, that was too bland, not interesting enough. If you went for more colourful things, then that was sort of frivolous. And it took us a while, and I did get advice on some of these things, a while to find a way to take clothes out of the equation. So you get less and less focus on appearance by getting a standard and acceptable look. I resented the fact that took even a minute of my time. I would have been, if there was a female equivalent of a suit and tie, I would have happily worn it every day. At the end of the day, I was Prime Minister. I wasn't, trying out for Paris Fashion Week. And I didn't consciously change my style, but because the times were turbulent, because I became increasingly aware that a style that I'd had as Deputy Prime Minister would get, more criticism and more attention as Prime Minister, I do think it kind of narrows for you what the range of behaviours is, and I think women feel that. I've heard Hillary Clinton say, and I think she's kind of caught the mood of it, that you go out to do a public appearance and your advisors are saying to you, don't say this, definitely say that, now go, be yourself, It doesn't all necessarily add up.
Not quite. I mean, clearly, your career is impressive in a whole range of ways, but the reason a lot of people know you is because of that speech in the House of Representatives, 7 years ago. Tell us about it, because that seems to me to be an occasion where you captured the emotion and anger that you were feeling, but still managed to put it into what was an incredibly compelling speech and hold it together. Now, most of us have been that angry at times, very rarely managed to do all of that in one go.
I didn't at any point have a sense of hot anger about it all. I had a sense of cool anger, frustration. So Our question time system in Australia is different to Westminster, not for us the curious civility of an occasional prime ministerial question time. Instead, we have question time every day Parliament sits. It's about an hour and a half. The Prime Minister goes every day. And what that means is the Prime Minister takes most of the questions in question time. You do that day in, day out, every parliamentary day. So if Parliament's sitting, as it often does, 20, 21, 22 weeks a year, you do it 80 odd times in a year. And, you know, our question time is a very ferocious place. We've had UK visitors come and sit in our gallery and watch it and wander away going, what was that? So it's tough. I expected on the day of that speech that we would have question time where the opposition would be trying to skewer me as a hypocrite on sexism because I had supported a particular man to become Speaker of the House of Representatives, and it had been revealed that he'd sent some sexist text messages, very, very repugnant text messages. Not anything I could have known at the time that I appointed him, but, you know, that logical inconsistency wasn't going to stop the opposition. So I got ready for question time, and in getting ready for question time, got a series of quotes from the then Leader of the Opposition, which were sexist quotes, which I was going to throw back over the dispatch box in question time. And I did have this sort of mounting sense of kind of cool anger that after everything I'd been to, now apparently I was going to be lectured on sexism. And when I got into the House, what happened was the Leader of the Opposition didn't proceed with question time, but moved to immediately have a debate. So that speech is actually my reply in that debate. And, you know, I gave it off some handwritten notes I scrawled while he was speaking and these quotes that I'd taken in with me. And so the fact it was off the cuff, that it caught this sense of cool anger, I think shows when people watch it. But I didn't at any point feel a burning sense of anger. And whilst I knew it had landed very solidly in the Parliament because, you know, the opposition's very close to you and they started off, you know, sort of yelling and jeering and then quietened as I gave the speech. So I knew it had been a forceful speech in the chamber, but I didn't have any sense that it would resonate beyond it in the way that it came to.
Can you see yourself making another speech like that about another topic?
Oh, no, I think you've got to probably settle at your high point, yeah.
Let's talk about women in power, you know, more generally. I mean, the Llywydd mentioned that we've had a good record here in Wales, you know, 40%, 50% at one point of women parliamentarians, which of course has made us world leading. But nobody here, I think, believes that that means we are a nation that has integral gender equality in other areas. But how important are the numbers? You know, we've seen a growth in the House of Commons in the UK, we've seen a growth, obviously, especially amongst the Australian Labour Party caucus. But where are we on this, and what's the importance of it?
Oh, I think the numbers are tremendously important. I mean, I'm of that generation of Labor women in Australia that fought for an affirmative action rule. And so when you know, we came to this campaigning, which was in the early 1990s, you know, if you looked at our national parliament, both us, the Labor Party, and the Conservatives were hopeless. We had 14% of our national political representatives were women, and they had 13%, so basically equal and both hopeless. And we campaigned to change this by having an affirmative action rule, which was adopted. And we worked together to create an organisation called Emily's List, which was a fundraising and support organisation for Labor women candidates. And, you know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I mean, in the May election campaign in Australia, Labor is now at 46% women. If we'd had a slightly better election, we would have got to 50-50. And the Conservatives didn't do a target. They did mentoring and networking and those kinds of things, and they've inched their way forward to sort of, you know, mid-20%, so well behind Labor. So I think, you know, this is a microcosm of a broader proposition, which is when we come to look at structures in which women are underrepresented, you often get these lines of debate. Do we need to kind of fix the women or do we need to fix the structures? I'm a big believer we need to fix the structures. And, you know, I think from a sort of democratic starting point, people ought to be able to look at their national parliament and see their faces reflected in it. And from a quality standpoint, there's no doubt in my mind that you know, the Labor affirmative action rule has raised the calibre of political representatives in the Labor Party. We are a better and stronger party.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that though, because you know we've with one of your colleagues, in fact, Professor Rosie Campbell, who I know you know very well, we've worked with the Assembly about a future electoral system that might embed gender quotas in it. And, you know, it seems to me, as somebody who's championed this for quite some time, you know, prescriptive legislative gender quotas, we get the same arguments thrown back at us that we had thrown at us 15, 20 years ago, which is, what about a meritocracy? And I think the arguments are really easy to explain, you know, that the concept of a meritocracy is a value-laden one, usually male values in most fields. But why is it that we're still having to make that case? You know, why is it that it's really sensible people, I think, who can see the value of having a more diverse parliament, still say, I'd rather be chosen on merit than as part of a quota or a favoured list?
Yeah, we had all of those arguments too, and sometimes they still get thrown up, I mean, crazily, given how much of a difficulty the Conservative side of politics has with women's representation and some other women's issues within it. This gets thrown across the chamber sometimes still in the National Parliament. I think it's because we don't get clear enough on why we're doing it and take it back to first principles, which is if you believe as I do that merit is equally distributed between the sexes and you look at any institution and you don't see around half men and half women, then it's got to mean something's gone wrong and it's held people of merit back. Second, I think we sometimes underestimate how much these arguments are just fuelled by power and privilege rather than rationality, which is people who have been favoured in the system don't always want to give away that power. Now, some men do, and when we adopted the affirmative action rule, Paul Keating, the same Labor Prime Minister that said we all get taken out in a box, love, he supported the rule, so he saw it. But a lot of his male colleagues did not. I remember one of them famously rushed up to one of the affirmative action campaigners after the rule change was adopted, saying, "You bitches, you've won," by way of congratulations. And she's joked that she's going to have on her gravestone, "Here lies the bitch, she won," to make sure that that's always marked. So it's frustrating that we're still going through the arguments, but we need to, because we still need further change.
And isn't one of the arguments that the contagion that we hoped would happen hasn't happened, as you mentioned, between the Labour Party in Australia and the Liberals? There hasn't been a spillover really in terms of your own affirmative action, and the same could be said about some of the parties in Wales and the UK. That without a prescriptive quota, you're always at risk of goodwill amongst a particular ideological position, really.
That's true. I mean, I actually think it has spilled over a little bit in Australia, which is, and it's one thing that's substantially changed since my time in politics. When I was there, the fashionable analysis by the Canberra Press Gallery was that nothing to do with my treatment had anything to do with gender. It just wasn't relevant. Then, in the years since, the Liberal Party has had a set of very visible disputes around the treatment of women, the low numbers of women that go forward for the Conservative Party, some women resigning, talking about bullying and the toxicity of the culture. And this has now spilled over into a public perception problem for the Liberal Party. So they are trying to do a series of things to remedy it. And whilst they haven't made the jump yet, there are a number of senior Liberals who, during the course of that discussion, have said, we should kind of get over it and recognise that, quotas targets work. So it's not landed yet, and maybe it will never land, but there's certainly been a spill of the kind of debates we had in the Labor Party in the early 1990s, which gave us the rule. They are now being had in the Conservative Party all these years later.
I mean, I'm conscious of the time, and I'd like to give some time to the audience to throw a few questions at you. But, I mean, where do you start with the drive to change things now? I mean, is it with young girls? Is it with schools? I mean, I know this is something you've been passionate about with your work in your current role. I mean, where do we start with this, or where do we accelerate it, I guess, is a better description?
Well, I've got a couple of big things that I do now that are the way in which my passion for gender equality gets expression in the days beyond politics. One is the reason I'm here in the UK. I'm working at King's College London with Professor Rosie Campbell and a fantastic team. We've got a Global Institute for Women's Leadership there, and the purpose of the institute, which is research focused, is to bear down on what is the best way of clearing the barriers that are stopping women coming through for leadership in equal numbers, not just in politics, but in business, in the law, in news media, in technology, the whole lot. And it's to answer that question where lots of organisations of goodwill have tried to do a whole lot of things to equalise outcomes for men and women. And they've done all of the obvious stuff, but they still find there are persistent problems. So we want to deepen the evidence base about how to get rid of those persistent problems. And then we want to make sure we're out there talking about it to anybody who will listen, so that the evidence gets into the hands of people who can use it. So that's important to me. The other thing that's important to me is I chair the major multilateral fund that focuses on school education in developing countries, and the face of the child most likely to miss out on a good quality education in a poor country, in a marginalised community, is a girl. So it sort of comes together for me with, education and opportunity as a start in life, and then clearing barriers out of the way so we see more female leaders.
So, we know you're very proud of your Welsh roots, Julia. We won't mention the Wales-Australia game, obviously. but if you were talking to a young girl in Wales now who was interested in politics or interested in leadership in any sector, really, would you advise her to go down that route? And what would be the lesson you try and pass on to her from your experience?
Oh, I absolutely would. I absolutely would encourage her to go down that route. I'm well aware in some ways I've got a very kooky life story that, a girl can be born here, leave here as a 4-year-old and turn up as the first female Prime Minister of Australia. It is kind of odd. But it's a story, I hope, that would impart to girls a sense that you can do anything, and what seems like it might be your life's path from the immediate circumstances around you as a child won't necessarily be your life's path. If you'd asked my parents when they landed in Australia in 1966, is it possible that, your daughter will end up even in Parliament, let alone anything else, they would have said, oh, that's ridiculous. That doesn't happen to families like us, and that doesn't happen to children like ours. It is possible. And I would also say it is worth it. And how I put that argument would depend a little bit on the age of the girl I was talking to. But I'd want to say to, sort of teenagers, I'm not going to insult your intelligence by pretending that there's no gender barriers or gendered bit. There still is. Even when you're ready for leadership, there probably still will be. But even with all of that, it's worth it, because in my view, there's no occupation, no pathway that enables you to bring more change and put your values into action more effectively than politics.
Thank you. Wonderful. Well, we've got some time for questions for Julia. I can't see much with these bright lights, so it is much brighter than you think, but please put your hand up, say who you are, and I'll try and... There's someone there, and there's two in the front here. Should we take that one first?
Hiya. So something that I was wondering, that especially emerging within feminist movements recently, is that when I look and see women in power now, you mostly see the same types of women. So for example, I see women representative, but I don't see very many gay women represented, or very many openly disabled represented. And we had 50-50 men's women in the Assembly, but we still never elected a woman of colour AM. We still never elected a transgender AM. And so I was wondering, how do we set up these structures so it's not just 50-50 gender representation, but that is representing all kinds of women, and so it's not just straight, white, middle-class, cisgender women. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a really good question, and it's something that I was focusing on in Australia quite recently, because there is a scholarship which is invested in my name by Emily's List, and the woman who got it this year focused her research on precisely this question. And she showed that whilst the Australian Parliament has diversified in terms of ethnic background, it's still not representative of the Australian population overall, so more to do. And more to do on other forms of representation, as you outline. Now, the best way of addressing that will depend on context. Her recommendation in her report was to think about how we would, I guess, even more fine-grain the affirmative action targeting approaches. That's one way of doing it. It's probably not the only way of doing it, and I'm always sensitive when I come to a different place and I'm not deeply embedded in your context, that maybe that makes sense here, maybe it doesn't, maybe there are other ways that would make sense here. But I do think it's the round of discussion we need to be having now. Okay. Shazia?
Hello, I'm Shazia Wan-Scully, and I was thinking you talked a lot about the toxic culture of hostile political debate, and we're seeing a lot of that now, and I'm just wondering, what do we actually do to change it?
Yeah, I ultimately think, we're living in an era of such huge change and transition, and one of the things that has given us this climate is the explosion of new media, the fracturing of the way that people get their political information, the anonymity, the coarsening of the debate that comes with all of that. And I do, in my optimistic moments, think we're seeing some early shoots of people starting to change their view about whether where we've got to is the place they want to end up. And I think it's a couple of things. I mean, one, it's just volume. When we got these phones and realised, you can get anything on them instantaneously the whole time. It's like we've spent more than a decade now looking down at our phones, and I think around the world people are starting to say to themselves, we really want to spend the next decade looking down at our phones, or maybe is there a different way to do this? And interestingly, the place that gave us the phones, Silicon Valley, actually there's a very lively debate about all of this now, about digital detox and screen time and kids and all the rest of it. Second, I think we spent a naive early period saying to ourselves, this is all good. You know, we used to have to wait for the morning newspaper, and now we can get it instantaneously. Something big happens in the world, you know about it 10 seconds later. This is amazing. And it's like now we've seen backstage, and backstage isn't so pretty because it's full of information harvesting and breaches of privacy. And in our naive adaptation to this adoption of this technology, we didn't even know they could do that for quite a long time. I didn't. I don't think lots of people did. Fake news, bots, you know, electoral manipulation. All of this we can see now behind the stage, and we're starting to question ourselves about, well, is this really where we want to be? And I think that is all early shoots, green shoots, around taking us to the next political stage. And I think in the next political stage, people are going to consume less media. They're going to want it a bit slower and a bit deeper. Things like tortoise media here in the United Kingdom are responding to this. Quality publications that offer you the longer reads are starting to see numbers go up. I think we're just starting to see a little bit of a change, but I don't want to suggest it's going to be here tomorrow. I think it took us a while to get ourselves in this burrow, and it's going to take us a while to get out, but I do feel like we're turning in the right direction.
I think we've got one from the upper circle there.
Oh, the upper circle.
Thank you. My name's Jack. My question, you mentioned your kooky upbringing, your kooky background. From there, where would be the thing that you would like people most to know about you, to get to know you as a person?
Well, I don't think either of my dear departed father or mother would quite want me describing my upbringing as kooky. I had a very ordinary childhood in lots of ways. We had a strong sense we were migrants, and the Welsh stories were told and retold. The Dylan Thomas readings were compulsory. Every time you'd looked at a movie, Mum would be saying, "Oh, he's Welsh. Oh, she's Welsh." We lived with all of that, and we lived with this striving and saving for a big trip back home, so that my father could see his mother before she died, and we could meet our grandmother. Of course, we had met her before we left, but I didn't remember it, and my sister, who was 3 years older, only had very, slight childhood memories of it. So we had a very ordinary upbringing, but what went to the local government schools did the things that, kids did. What was slightly different about it, though, given my childhood was in the 1960s and 1970s, is even though my sister and I, both girls, both our mother and our father always said to us, you can do anything you want, you should think about a career, you should want to go to university, you should want to study hard. Education is a fantastic privilege. We got denied it, you're getting it, make the most of it. And so they always told us to aim big. And many girls of my generation would have been taught, don't bother so much with hitting the books, because you'll only work for a short period of time before you get married, have kids, and then your future will be as a full-time wife and mother. We were never taught that. So the thing I would take out of that is that sort of sense of enabling environment, even if you come from a very ordinary home in an income sense and all the rest of it, really makes a huge difference to the kinds of aspirations kids can have, but particularly that girls can have.
Good. Just there.
Hi, my name is Sarah Rees from the Women's Equality Party. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you, because it was after hearing you speak last time you were here that I took the step to go into politics and stand for election. And you taught a lot. You said a lot of things that were really, really supportive and helpful. Since then, I've had a second child, and to be involved in politics or any sort of leadership makes that really difficult. And you mentioned barriers, but I'd like to know what you think could be done to overcome some of those barriers for women in politics and leadership.
Yeah, I think first barrier we need to overcome is I always thought, and still do think, that for women in politics there's no right answer to the question, do you have children? Because if you don't and I don't, then the next question is, how can you understand anything about real life? You don't have your own kids. And if you do, like you do, it's like, hell, who's looking after your kids? Like, what are you doing here? Why aren't you home with your kids? So we need everybody to move beyond that stage, or if they are going to question politicians about care of their children, they question male and female politicians equally, but not just question the women. Second, there are things that, I mean, Australia is a big country, everybody's got to fly into Canberra. For many people this is, 4 hours flight away, like a big journey to get there. There have been sort of practical things done to support women with kids which used not to be done. In one very celebrated change, the non-members bar was turned into a childcare centre. They did take the bottles of alcohol out in the transition. So, there's more supports than there used to be. But then I think more broadly, and this is a statement about politics, but it's a statement more broadly than politics, another thing that will make a big difference is when the various flexibilities given are equally used by men. And at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, the research on this is incredibly clear. If it's only women that use the family-friendly flexibilities available in their workplace and the time off and all the rest of it, then that'll be the mummy track, and that's the second track. If men and women both use them, then there's no penalty for anybody using them. And that's the normalisation that we have to go through, where it is equally likely that a man takes a period of time off around the birth of his child, that it's equally likely he asks to go part-time or limited hours or flexible hours because he's going to, truly take half of the childcare arrangements. When that happens, then we'll get this greater sense of equality around children in the workplace and career advancement, including in politics. Good. Gentleman here.
Hi, Julia. Hi. I wanted to ask, being a woman on the left of the political spectrum, do you feel with the Rupert Murdoch-dominated media in Australia, that was part of the reason why it was so aggressive, the media attacks on you were so aggressive? Do you think if Julia Bishop became leader of the Liberal Party, she would have faced the same sort of antagonism and aggression that you did?
I mean, you never get to run any control tests in politics, so these things are always best guesstimates. But there's no doubt that the media environment in which the government I led worked was a fevered environment, and particularly fevered from the Murdoch press. Now, whether that was because they objected to there being a Labor government, whether it was because they objected to our carbon pricing arrangements, whether it was they objected to how I got there, whether they objected to me as a woman, whether it was some sort of mix-up of all of the above, hard to tell. But certainly, there were things done in the coverage that you look back on, or even at the time, extraordinary. I mean, to give you one example, I stumbled in India, physically stumbled. I was walking towards a bank of television cameras over a grassed surface and didn't realise that there was a sort of little dip, a pothole, and lost my footing, rolled my ankle, and I fell quite heavily. I got straight back up and kept walking towards the TV cameras and gave the press conference, and journos were asking me, was I all right, and all the rest of it, and I was all right. The Daily Telegraph, which is one of Murdoch's big selling papers in Australia, not only had this on the front page, but you could turn inside for a 2-page spread that gave you frame by frame of my fall. Just a deliberate attempt to humiliate. So, stuff like that was, beyond the pale and I do think it was the attitude of those newspapers was it was about the politics and us being a progressive party, a Labor Party, but the expression of it often then drew on the most sort of gendered tropes to make the case against the government. Dallas, up there.
Thing frontline politics, you said that what you had gone through was going to make it easier for the next woman and the woman after that, and you were proud of that. And you've spoken tonight about the resilience that you have had to have throughout your career. Do you think that we'll only have true equality for women in politics when women don't have to have that extra resilience, or do you think that's always going to be part of it?
No, I think we'll have true equality when women don't have to have that extra resilience. I do genuinely think it will be easier for the next woman in Australia. And I think the fact we've got this lively debate now about sexism in politics, which we didn't have when I was Prime Minister, means that the media is much more sensitised about whether their reporting is sexist, the penalty paid by a journalist for sexist reporting is much sharper and sooner because of the social media reaction. And I think, you know, there are some journalists, one actually said it very clearly in a recent piece when she did an interview with me, who looked back at their reporting at the time and regret that they reported that way now, that they weren't, you know, clearer and firmer about where the lines were and how gendered this had become. So I do think it will be easier for the next woman, but it won't be equal until there's no extra burden or penalty to be paid by a female leader, and that'll be no extra focus on appearance, no extra focus on family structure, no extra sort of toxicity on social media, and it will be the end of the unconscious sort of biases in our head which, you know, whisper to us that a commanding woman in a leadership position is probably not very likeable because she's offending against gender stereotypes about empathy and nurturing, that all of that's busted out of our heads as well.
Julia, time has got the better of us, but can I, on behalf of everyone here, thank you for such an honest and fascinating hour. You've been very frank with your experiences, and I think it's only by talking about some of these things that we can move forward in the way that you've described tonight. So, diolch fawr iawn o bawb yma.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.